First edition, Friends with Benefits, the India-US story, Seema Sirohi in conversation with C Raja Mohan. In the 90s and in the 90s and the 80s, the US viewed Pakistan and China favorably, but saw India as a giant hindrance. India's on the wrong side of history, President Bill Clinton declared. Cut to the present, and the geopolitical arena is dramatically different. What took India and the US so long to get in sync? Did political leaders show the way, or did Foreign Office Mandarin change the game? Was China's long shadow the deciding factor, or did the Indian diaspora bring the two closer? And are the two democracies finally ready for a full-fledged relationship, or will they remain friends with benefits? To look for answers, the book takes the reader to the twilight years of the Cold War and charts the diplomatic journey using first-hand reportage and drawing from conversations with key players, policymakers, and former intelligence officials. Seema Sirohi is a Washington-based columnist for the Economic Times. Let's welcome Seema. For the Economic Times, India's largest business daily, and an analyst for Observer Research Foundation. India's premier think tank, she writes on foreign policy and India's place in the world. She did cover India-US relations for more than 3 decades, tracking their progress through difficult times. She's also reported from Rome, Vienna, Jerusalem, Bratislava, Islamabad, and New Delhi. She has appeared on BBC, NDTV, India Today, TVCNN, NPR as a commentator. Her first book, Sita's Curse, Stories of Dowry Victims, was published in 2003. C Raja Mohan is a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi and a visiting research professor at the National University of Singapore. Earlier, he was director of the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore and founded the Carnegie India Center in New Delhi. He's columnist on international affairs for foreign policy and the Indian Express. His research work focuses on India's foreign policy, Eurasian geopolitics, Indo-Pacific security, and global governance of advanced technologies. His recent books include Asia's New Geopolitics, Military Power, and Regional Order. Before Seema and Raja Mohan sit down for the session, I would invite them, Raja, to launch the book for Seema. Congratulations, Seema. And now for a conversation, Friends with Benefits, the Indian-US story, Seema Sirohi in conversation with C Raja Mohan.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this session on India-US, a new book that Seema has just published. So congratulations, Seema. I wish I had written this book because I think with Seema, we have covered this relationship for a long time. So I think Seema has done a wonderful job. So it's a great book. It's easy to read because she's been a journalist. So journalists write more easily. And I think it comes at a time when there is really a lot of interest in the India-US relationship. But the passion that the US generates in India, both pro and anti, is not matched by as much of information, of actual analysis. So I think we have a huge gap. So I think Seema's book does a great service, I think, to really plug that gap and take this relationship to make it understood by a larger number of people. So this is really timely and very welcome edition. So Seema, just let me begin by asking you, why did you write this book? It's easy to write columns, but books,
Books are hard to write, but I've been in Washington for so long, almost 3 decades now. I saw the relationship change from a place where the two countries were really not talking to each other, or they were just kind of barking at each other most of the time, finding faults, to a place where India and the US are talking in every domain, be it space, maritime, trade, Indo-Pacific, what have you. So I've seen the transformation and I was struck by that. So I thought I should document it.
Yeah. No, I think in that sense, it's really, as I said, no other relationship of India's has so fundamentally transformed as the relationship with the United States. When I was just looking at some figures the other day, India-US trade in 1990 was $5 billion, $5 billion total annual. Russian trade, India's trade with Soviet Union was higher than India's trade with US at that time. But today, India-US trade is about $160 billion a year, 160, from 5 to 160, including goods and services. And the trade with Russia till last year was around 8 billion. I mean, it tells you how much the US, the relationship has changed. And partly you can see, the queues on visas, for the US embassy, you can always see that. And now there is a new addition in India. If you go to Hyderabad, next to the US consulate, there is a visa temple. So if you want to go in, before you go in for your interview, pray the Lords that you get a visa. And we see more and more Indians actually going to the US, and anybody who does engineering, I'm sure all of them want to go to the US. So it's really a phenomenal change. But the title, I wanted to ask you about the title, Friends with Benefits. Sounds, a sexy title. I'm sure it's a catchy title as well. But is it really that transactional that we really do it just for gains and really no commitment to each other?
No more. It's not transactional anymore. But I know this title has aroused some mirth, some curiosity, some laughter. But what I was trying to convey is that India and the US are not allies in the technical sense of the word. They're not enemies either. So they're more than friends, but less than an ally. So I just wanted to convey this sense. And a friend of mine came up with this title. It's not mine. So.
It's a good title. So please do read the book. I think there's a lot there. I think the whole story of the last 30 years. If you're looking at the last 30 years, I think when was the turning point? If you go back to early 90s, the US was saying, look, Kashmir is not really part of India. They were asking India to negotiate with Pakistan on Kashmir. If you go to the early 90s, there was so much focus on Kashmir, nuclear, this kind of stuff. So where did it change from being a hostile, mutually suspicious, and even lowest official, as some of the people here who dealt with the relationship, I see Ambassador Pinak Chakravarti, anybody who came from the US, it would be a headline, are they out to get us, are they squeezing our arm? So it was like all the time the fear, the suspicion in Delhi of what the US might do to us.
Yeah.
How have they become our best friends?
See, in the late 80s, when I went to Washington, there were just 2-3 topics that dominated the relationship. One was America's non-proliferation concerns. The other was Kashmir policy. Somehow they wanted India and Pakistan to resolve this issue because the Pakistanis would ask the Americans to put pressure on India, etc. I think the turning point, in my opinion, came during the Kargil War, when President Bill Clinton took a very clear stand in favor of India. He said Pakistan has to go back and respect the line of control. Until then, the US policy, even in Clinton's first term, there was an official called Robin Rayfield who questioned the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, which aroused, a lot of anger in New Delhi. So I would say Kargil was.
So, I mean, you saw in fact, July 4th, when Nawaz Sharif flew all the way to Washington, hoping that the Americans will at least mediate on Kashmir, at least they get a commitment from Washington to mediate on Kashmir. But that didn't really, I mean, that was the period, I think, that it could have gone either way. So what made Bill Clinton change?
I think the US intelligence clearly showed who was, coming on whose side. The Pakistanis had come into the Indian side. And there were a couple of political appointees in the White House who basically wanted Clinton to be very clear on this and leave a legacy. So this was towards the end of Clinton's second term. And he was convinced to do that. And the funny thing was that these officials did not want to leave Clinton and Nawaz Sharif alone in the room, because they felt that, Nawaz Sharif could convince Clinton otherwise. So they wanted to monitor everything. They were very clear with the Pakistanis that if you don't respect the line of control and you refuse to go back, then we have a statement ready. And they gave them just two options: respect and go back. Otherwise, US is not going to bail Pakistan out.
A few months later, Bill Clinton came to India. He came to Rajasthan, actually. There's a nice picture of him dancing with Rajasthani dancers at the time. Riding an elephant. And we saw the parliament, from a hostile parliament, we saw Indian parliamentarians falling over each other to shake Bill Clinton's hands. In some ways, that kind of captured the beginning of change.
Absolutely. And, Clinton is a people's person. He can connect with people anywhere in the world, I think. So yes, in the Indian Parliament, he got a rock star treatment, absolutely. And that signified the turn. But then it was on the up and up with George W. Bush.
Yeah. But before that, in the 70s and 80s, there was very little business. As I said, look, in 1990, our total trade was just $5 billion with the US. We had very little commercial relationship, while you had serious political differences. If you had a commercial relationship, that would balance the differences on absence of good political relationship. But for India, for a long time, kept the Americans out. They were not only welcome, we kept the board outside, saying India is not open to business. And many of you would not have been born at the time. In 77, we were very proud that we threw out IBM from India. That IBM was by a deliberate policy decision was thrown out of India by the Janta government in 1977. It tells you something of India's commercial attitudes, that American business was not welcome. And today we have actually the biggest business relationship is with the United States. So how did that change? What were the economic reforms that led to?
Absolutely. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's reforms made the US businesses very interested in India after not looking at India for years because India was not open for business. The reforms aroused some interest, and the Indian diaspora also. So Indian Americans have done very well in the United States. If you remember, in the year 2000, there was this computer problem called the Y2K, for which lots and lots of computer engineers were needed, and the H-1B process got going, and a lot of Indians went there. There's goodwill for Indian Americans in the US. They're appreciated for their skills, for their ability to get along.
No, if you go back to the 90s, the focus was all on Pakistan and how Pakistan affected India-US relationship. But today it's all about China. India has problems with China, the US has problems with China. So there's a fundamental change in the way the China factor is playing in our bilateral relationship. If you remember, Bill Clinton went to Beijing in 2000, just after our nuclear tests, and together they said, look, we're going to, push India and Pakistan, their nuclear weapon programs back. So how did the China factor change so fundamentally between us? Because in the past it was seen as a problem, but today much of the convergence at the political level is because both of us have problems with China.
It's taken the United States a long time to wake up to China. I think Indian diplomats were always telling their US counterparts about China, about its hegemonic designs, whatever you want to call it. And during Clinton's 2 terms, the US sold a lot of technology legally, openly to China, which they are now trying to curb. So it's a very interesting change. It's only when Xi Jinping made it very clear in his multiple speeches that his program is not to work with the US, but to displace the US, is when the Americans started to wake up, started to happen during the Obama administration. During Donald Trump's, it really came out in the open.
Because it's also Xi Jinping, I think it seemed to have pushed India,
Yes.
to get closer to the US, because India, even till recently, till 5 years ago, we were still this non-aligned, in between, not on either side. But the Chinese have changed that calculation fundamentally by series of military conflicts we've had with China. 2013, 2014, 2017 at Doklam, and then 2020 Galwan.
Yes.
So was these 4 conflicts actually?
Yes, I think 2020 Galwan crisis really clarified the Indian mind, I would say. And the US came to India's help in many ways. The US was giving India real-time intelligence. It sent...
This in the Galwan War?
During this 2020 crisis, even though India and the US had not signed that agreement under which you can share such information, but they were sharing it with us. Then the US also sent cold weather gear, because so many soldiers were deployed at the same time. We didn't have that kind of gear. So the Pentagon sent all their spare stuff. I think that made India feel that, yes, and the US also made a lot of public statements, which the Europeans did not. That's something to remember.
But have we, our Prime Minister Modi, when he went to speak at the US Congress in 2016 summer, he said, our historic hesitations in dealing with America are over. But are they really over? You still see, if you read our discourse, as opposed to our government policy, it's still one of, bristling about the US. Are we getting too close? Are we getting, is that, so have we really changed, despite how much the government-to-government relationship has changed? But the public debate, especially in the foreign policy community, seems still a lot of hesitation. So, for example, on the Ukraine war, we still seem to think Russia is our best friend forever, rather than the United States, which has done so much for us.
I think with the Ukraine war, it's all very for pragmatic reasons, I would say. We are dependent on Russian armaments and spare parts and things like that. So we can't cut off that overnight, but India is diversifying. We are buying more and more from the United States. I think last count, India was flying 8 platforms that are made in the US. All of our transport...
Like C-130, C-17.
So the big planes that evacuate citizens in times of crisis are all American-made that we bought. So in terms of strategic community still having some doubt, I think one section will always be that way. And also I think there is still that feeling that if you completely jumped on the American bandwagon, China would then come after us even more. So there's that. And the minister, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, has made it a point that he wants a multipolar world and that India should be a pole in that. So I think maybe that's a bit of an explanation.
Since you mentioned the Mr. Minister Jaishankar, who said the Delhi debate is still, hesitant about engaging the US, but he also pointed to the so-called street at the popular level, the interest, the stakes with US. For example, if you go to Bangalore and Silicon Valley are tied at the hip, that you have so much of interaction between the technological communities. We're not even talking about diaspora here, which is a huge amount. We'll come back to that. But the quality of the civil society engagement is very different from the government or the strategic community arguments in Delhi, because the way India has moved on, from being suspicious of the US to one of more open to engaging, and is that going to be a fundamental factor changing the context of the relationship?
I think so. The people have always been ahead of the government in the relationship with the US, I would argue. Polling by Pew Research showed back in, I think it was 2014 or something like that, even earlier, that Indian citizens thought of the United States as a friend. So people have been ahead. Even the bureaucrats who criticize US policy, their kids are all studying in the US. So, it's one of those things.
Everybody has a son, a nephew, cousin, in the US, which is actually, so maybe there's a moment to talk about diaspora. Today we have almost 5 million Indians, and it's grown consistently. And the other day, the Indian caucus, there are 5 of them in the US Congress, the latest one. And there was a new one that got elected. It's called the Samosa Caucus, as some people have called it. So one of the Samosa Caucus members was saying that, look, Indians might be just 1% of the US today, around 5 million people, but they pay 6% of the taxes. So Indians are doing pretty well. The rich.
They are the richest ethnic minority in the US, most successful, most educated. So yes, they've done very well. You look at the big companies, the CEOs are of Indian origin, Google, Microsoft, etc. Indians have done very well. And people don't have a hesitation in employing Indians. This is something I've noticed.
But looking ahead, where do you see this relationship going? I think we still, for example, you talked about defense cooperation. We still haven't bought a fighter aircraft from the Americans. Is there something there? We're going to look at this because now Americans are talking about, helping India build its own defense industrial infrastructure. We've just realized how deeply we are tied to Russia on weapons. Almost 80% of the weapons still come from Russia, spare parts, etc., as we face the Chinese threat. Because India is saying, look, we don't want to move from Russian dependence to American dependence or anybody else. But Mr. Modi is talking about doing more defense production at home. So is there more possibility for producing US defense equipment in India?
I think the US can do much better if it genuinely takes part in this Make in India program. But the problem is the US bureaucracy is as large and as cumbersome, I would say.
I would say larger and doubly cumbersome.
Okay. I'd agree with you, but Americans don't like it when I say that. For every process we have here, they have two to counter, So for them to change, it takes a long time. Then every 4 years, they have a new president. And then you have to start kind of all over again, depending on that president's commitment to the India relationship. So the thing is, US is a global power. It has global interests. India is an important country, a very important country, increasingly important, but it's not an urgent issue for them because India is not a problem country. So we kind of sometimes fall between two stools, you might say, And to focus the White House's attention and to give direction to the Pentagon to change, it just takes forever. I mean, I am surprised personally how long it takes for them to change certain procedures.
One of the interesting features of our relationship has been, if you read the newspapers, it's always pessimistic. Oh my God, there's one more problem with the Americans. We got, right now, Americans don't like what we say on Ukraine. We don't like what they do when they're talking to Pakistan. But actually, if you look at the vector over a period of last 30 years, I mean, it has dramatically evolved. I mean, while at every stage it looked like it's going to collapse, it's not going to go any further, we've seen it really continue to grow. So what do you attribute that to? I mean, the pessimism at the public level, actually, but progress if you've taken over a longer period?
Yeah, the trajectory has been dramatic, from what I saw in 1988, 89 to today. I think the size of India, the size of India's market, India's position in Asia, India as a possible counter to China, because now the Americans are fully awake about the Chinese threat. So in that sense, India has it looms larger than ever before.
See, one thing that has changed in the relationship is the Quad. This is the Quadrilateral Security Forum. We sit with the Americans, Japanese, and the Australians. I mean, if you think 10 years ago, anyone who could say, look, India is going to sit with the Americans in the same coalition, because in the name of non-alignment, we kind of kept away from the Americans so far. I mean, that was almost like a matter of political principle. That is, if you said, let's be nice to America, we're almost unpatriotic. This was the situation many years ago. But today we are sitting with them in Quad, and we do all kinds of things from vaccines to industry. That's a big change that has taken place. But
again, China was the reason when we raised the level of Quad to foreign ministers level during the Trump administration. And India was very interested in reviving the Quad. I mean, we think that the US has pushed India most of the time into getting into the Quad, but I think India also...
India is not a little baby to be pushed, but that's part of the debate, as if we are so vulnerable that Americans are going to push us around. I mean, look, we're soon, I don't know if today we're already the largest population country. We're supposed to be the fifth largest economy, third largest military force, and the fifth largest military spending. Yet, if you read the debate, there's a constant, oh my God, we're being pushed. Oh my God, my arm is going to be twisted. I mean, I think it says more to the lack of self-assurance than the American capacity to push you.
Absolutely. I don't know how many times I've mentioned this in my column that India's too big to be pushed around.
India's can't fit into anybody's pocket either.
Yeah, yes. Today's India is not the India of the 1960s, 70s. I mean, it's a large country and it's grown in national power. So yes, I don't understand why people don't have the confidence. Nobody can push a large country around. And India is doing what it's doing with the United States of its own free will because it sees its national interest being served. Because every country has to ultimately decide its priorities, and India has decided.
I think one of the benefits of being friends with the US is the US doesn't come alone. It's like Shivji ka Barat. I mean, so you bring in the US is your friend, Japan is your friend. US is your friend, Australia is your friend. If US is your friend, half the Europeans are your friends. So in a way that the expansion of India's relationship with the West as a whole came as a consequence of the transformed relationship with the US. I mean,
yes, we got a lot of benefits with other Western countries and other allies.
Even Britain, I mean.
Yes, and other allies of the US like Japan. I mean, but India also did a lot of work in improving its relationship with Japan during Manmohan Singh's time. And then Prime Minister Modi took it forward.
So one is the Quad in the Indo-Pacific that we talk about. There is another Quad in the Middle East. I mean, it's still not as important, but it is there. India, Israel, US, and United Arab Emirates. It's a bunch of strange characters, right? I mean, that if you look at India's historic policy in the Middle East, one of the three central principles of India's foreign policy was to keep away from America because we didn't want to be seen with the Americans. We didn't want to be seen with the Israelis. For a long time, we didn't even have diplomatic relations with them. And we didn't want to be seen with the Gulf sheikhs. So they are your best friends today. I mean, so in fact, even 2 years ago, people used to say, oh, in the East, it's fine. India and the US can be friends in the Indo-Pacific, but India and the US can never be friends in the Middle East. But there we are, with a new Quad, sitting with the Americans and the Gulf sheikhs.
I think we have to give credit to those who are making foreign policy in New Delhi. I think they are thinking differently. They're thinking bigger and shedding the old think to a large extent. I mean, I grew up at a time when we were all pro-Palestinian. I mean, I went to JNU and we wanted a revolution. So, things like that. Things have changed. I mean, India's diversified and now again it's becoming a leader of the global South. That's another very interesting development.
No, you can see easily what India benefits by being friends with the US. What benefits has the US got by being friends with India? Because you remember the big debate, I mean, many of you might be young, in 2005, to the nuclear deal, poor Manmohan Singh had to go to the parliament with a confidence vote. I mean, if you read the debate at that point, both the BJP, at that time Mr. Advani was the leader of BJP, and the CPM under Prakash Karat, were saying, look, India will be finished if you do this deal. I mean, you'll lose your independent foreign policy. You're going to be dead if you do a deal. I mean, which is... But 15 years later, we haven't bought a single reactor from the Americans, and all the reactors have gone to the what little we bought has come from the Russians. So, is there? I mean, what have they got? I mean, is that debate takes place in Washington?
Well, they've got our friendship, number one. But you're right that India was supposed to buy US nuclear reactors, and that just never happened because there was a law passed in the Indian Parliament that made it very difficult. The liability law. So the American manufacturers were kind of wary of selling anything. They wanted the law changed. There is a sense of disappointment in Washington that India hasn't bought any reactors, hasn't gone for any of the big planes that America wants to sell, the F-18 for the Indian Navy. So that... Some people have even told me, one senator famously said he wished that he could take his vote back for the nuclear deal. So there is a sense of disappointment. They bring it up quite often.
But to speak more, objectively, I think having India, which was once a leading non-aligned country, be with the United States, I mean, that itself, in a way, sitting in the Quad. Otherwise, there was no basis for the Quad. I mean, I think, look, Japan and Australia are treaty allies of the United States. The whole idea was to have India as a partner in the process. So, in a sense, by India being its size, its weight, brings something to the relationship.
And Indian Navy, the capacity of the Indian Navy, as it showed in the tsunami relief efforts, I think all these countries were impressed that we can project power.
And also, if you think of long-term balancing of China, I mean, it's really without India, it can't be done. Therefore, that too is something they're investing in over the longer term.
Right. And we must also remember that all these countries, Australia in particular, they have changed their mind about India. I remember when I first became a journalist in New Delhi, and the Australian diplomats would raise their eyebrows about India trying to develop what is called a blue water navy. They were very suspicious, and as were the Americans. So even Indian Navy's presence in the Indian Ocean was seen as something problematic.
I think partly the American pragmatism also comes from follow the money. That is, if you see India is going to be a growing economy, that there are, if your long-term engagement with India, given today already on the IT sector and a whole range of areas where the US will benefit, I mean, also India will benefit. But therefore, I think despite all the disappointments, they continue to engage.
Because the benefits are more than the disappointments in sum total, I would say.
And the expectations over the longer term of what India can bring to the table in the world. One of the other changes that we've seen is the drawing of India into the G7 process. We're talking so much about G20, but actually there's something called the G7. These are the real bosses, the 7 industrialized countries. Is there a prospect that you see that India can be working much more closely? Because we're being now continuously invited to the G7 summits. Is there a way that's really the place for us, that you be one of the top dogs of the international system?
I think, I'm not sure if the Indian policymakers have a clear mind about that, because they are trying to be the leader of now G77 again, so to say, the developing world. So to sit at that big table, I mean, the way Indian foreign policy sometimes goes, we want to sit at every table. And so maybe that's what, but one thing I wanted to discuss before we run out of time is the diaspora.
Yeah, please. I mean, I think as we briefly mentioned, there are 5 million Indians and the politics of the diaspora. I mean, you can tell us a bit.
Yeah, so the Indian diaspora is increasingly important. They're showing their political clout. They are major donors to both Republicans and Democrats. But what I've noticed lately in the past 6-7 years, the divisions that we are seeing in India also sort of manifest in the US. So there are divisions between Hindu Americans and Muslim Americans, and Indian Muslims are kind of more aligned with Arab Muslims in the US, not with other Indian Americans. So that I find could be a source of trouble in times to come, because all of these groups exercise power through Capitol Hill, where the legislature is. So they lobby the congressmen and senators and get things done. There could be some trouble. And Indian diplomats will have to work even harder.
Yeah, even caste. I mean, one is religion. There's a new book called Caste, which was in California. The discrimination against Indian lower caste by the Indian upper caste who dominate the Silicon Valley. Is that a serious issue as well?
It is a serious issue. We don't want to acknowledge it, but too many cases have come up in these large companies like Google and Facebook of this kind of caste discrimination. And Dalit activists in America are very vocal about it. So they have aligned with left activists and progressive Democrats to sort of raise this issue and make noise. So yes, that is an issue. All of India's problems, or various social manifestations, are coming to the US and manifesting there as well.
Yeah, and we didn't even talk about regional associations. I mean, every language, every region has more than one association. But so far, I think, can they come together? Like in the nuclear deal, we saw them come together.
That was a rare coming together. It doesn't happen easily, and lot of work needs to be done. For example, there's no one pan-American association of all Indian Americans. I wish there were, like the Jewish Americans have. I know that Indian Americans always want to emulate the Jewish American lobby, but they can't come together. Telugu Association, Bengali Association, they're all sort of different.
So we're just taking India abroad. I mean, so when we take India abroad, I mean, we take it all with us. I mean, I think that's part of the process. So I think it'll have to find its own way of settling. So we got about 10 minutes left. So those of you who want to ask any questions, please identify yourself, ask a short question so that we can take more questions. Yes, I'll start with you. Yeah. Yeah, you. Is there a microphone? Yes, I think it'll come to you at the back. Yeah. No, wait, sir, can you just give it here, the microphone? Yeah.
Can you stand up? Maybe then they can spot you.
James Curran from Sydney University in the History Department. I just wanted to read to you a quote. I'd be interested in both your reaction to this quote. This is from Michael Green, former NSC Director for Asia in the Bush administration. I interviewed him for the Financial Review, Australian Financial Review, late last year. He said this, "To me," he said, "the most geopolitically important thing we can do with India is to make sure that India has the capacity to be a net exporter of security in the Indian Ocean. We don't want that vacuum to open. That's not about alignment," he said, "as much as it is about helping India deal with its own capacity. That should be the American focus." Now, the Indian Ocean is one thing, but other Quad members, as I'm sure you would know, such as especially Japan, Australia, and indeed the United States, would desire, I think, India to take on strategic obligations in the Western Pacific. To what extent could that be in India's national interest?
Yeah. No, my sense is, look, Michael Green, I think both of us know him. I think under the Bush administration, Michael was a critical player. He was the senior director for South Asia in the White House at the time when we did the nuclear deal. So I think he's been a strong champion of India-US relations, as well as India-Japan relationship. He's a Japan specialist. So look, I think India's engagement with the Western Pacific has grown and will continue to grow. But I think many of our friends in the West expect stand up tomorrow, so we're not going to be in Australia, we're not going to be in Japan, that wherever America sails, India is also going to sail with them into the ships. But I think what we're looking today is, in the Indo-Pacific, is there a way we can share the burdens in a way that all of us can benefit? Today there are problems in the Himalayas, there are problems in the Senkakus, which is Japan and China. There are problems in South China Sea, thanks to Chinese assertiveness. There is talk about China invading Taiwan, and then there is the Indian Ocean. So I think if we can think of these 4 conflict zones as an integrated zone, and within that, how do we build up on the existing understandings and cooperation between India, US, Australia, and Japan? I think that's the direction we should be going. But I think, as we said, we are just beginning in this process because there was no security cooperation before. The Quad came back into life. It's only at the summit level, only in 2021. So I think we're just at the beginning of this process. My sense is the direction of this relationship between India and the US and its allies will continue to grow. But India would be unique. It can't just be a treaty ally, but I think it's a way we develop terms of cooperation, terms of partnership. That is the process we are involved in. There's someone from this side. Yes, ma'am. I'll come to you.
Hello, my name is Neha. My question is talking about relationships. If you're talking that India and US share this relationship, that is not just friends, but also not allies. So how do you see the relationship between Pakistan and US?
It's a difficult relationship, increasingly difficult for the US to deal with Pakistan. At one time, there was a lot more alignment in what the US wanted in South Asia. They got it through Pakistan. They were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So Pakistan was a conduit for, sending money and weapons to the Mujahideen. Now, the disillusionment with Pakistan has grown quite a bit, but there are sections in the US bureaucracy, just like in the Indian bureaucracy, I'm sure, who still think of Pakistan as very important for US policy goals. And now that US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, they don't want to jettison Pakistan completely because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and they want to monitor Pakistan. And I think it's also in India's interest that Pakistan is tethered somewhat to the United States and not completely gone into the Chinese camp.
No, but I would say, I think, there's a saying that you don't want to kill someone who's trying to commit suicide. You don't want to. Look, I think Pakistan's own trajectory of the last 40 years has been really, I mean, nobody has done more destruction to themselves. They've done more destruction to themselves. That today, you know, Pakistan's economy is 10 times smaller than India's. They're stuck at around 350 billion. I mean, India is at $3.5 trillion. Their economy today is smaller than Bangladesh's. There's a clear gap of nearly $70-80 billion between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And if you take the population growth rates, which Pakistan has very high population growth rates and low economic growth rates, and Bangladesh is the opposite. So the gap between them is going to continue to grow. So I think the way we think about the region must also change. On Bangladesh's per capita GDP is $1,000 more than Pakistan's per capita GDP. So I think we're in a new situation. And within that, we all have grown up with the India-Pakistan, India-Pakistan. For the Americans too, when it meant South Asia, it's India-Pakistan. But today, I think one of the things that has changed is that the US is shifting focus from Afghanistan to the Indo-Pacific, from a continental insurgency fighting strategy to a maritime strategy of great power competition. I think within that, Pakistan does not figure. And I think that is, so in a way that it is a declining relationship. And just yesterday in the US Congress, somebody was moving a resolution to, to take away the so-called non-NATO ally status. So I think once Americans left Afghanistan, Pakistan's value for the United States has declined, and I think it will continue to decline. But for us, look, we must also be clear, look, Pakistan, you can't expect nobody is going to do anything with Pakistan. I mean, 200 million people, large army, nuclear weapons. So they'll be around, but I think the terms of engagement have turned, I would say, largely in our favor. So there's a gentleman there, I think. Yeah, yes, sir.
So you touched upon a lot of topics around the US-India relationship, and I'm really curious about the energy problem. Like, energy is a big problem in like today's world, and it has India is largely dependent on Russia regarding energy. So what's like India-US stance on the energy crisis? And
let's take two more questions. Yeah, thanks. And if we take those two more brief questions, one I see. Yes, sir. Please at the back. Please, go ahead quickly. I think we don't have much time, so if we can ask your question quickly. Yeah, got the question. Yes, sir, please. Yeah, please. Quickly, yeah.
Just a quick one. In the India-US story, what role do you see for economic cooperation and role of corporate America as well as Indian business houses?
So maybe the last question from us.
You talked about the US-India commercial relationship as an asset and, in a sense, a building block for the relationship. Correspondingly, is the Indian economic relationship with China a counterpoint to that? Does it affect our ability to achieve geostrategic, geopolitical independence from China? And how does that impact our relationship with the US?
So I think we have four good questions. I mean, energy, domestic politics, business and corporate houses, and also the China economy. You want to?
So on the energy question, India is buying nearly $4 billion worth of natural gas and oil from the US as well. So it's not that we're only buying from Russia. And the US actually needs to build more capacity to sell more. So we are in a good spot there. On the economic relationship, trade has been a real problem between the two countries, between the US and India. We have lots and lots of issues. I'll give you one example, quick one. Cheese. American cheese, we want a certification from American farmers that this cheese is from cows that have eaten vegetarian diet and not what they call blood meat.
Seema, I think we...
That's, those kind of issues, the Americans don't understand why vegetarian means vegetarian.
No, I think we need to close this. Like all good things must come to an end. I think we are, as we just warming up, as always, the session comes to close. Energy, look, US is a major supplier now. The Russian purchases were really on a specific context of the Ukraine war and the international market being squeezed. But over the last 5 years, America has become one of the major exporters of oil, natural gas, liquefied LNG to us. Second, I think on domestic politics, I don't know, separating domestic politics from foreign policy is never easy, but today we see a lot more of that that is unfolding, and I think that's part of the reality, but that's not the discussion here. In terms of the business linkages, I think I would say that's really the longer term, that I think we're beginning to move away from what we call G to G relationship. It's really our joint secretary negotiating with their assistant secretary. If the commerce and trade grow, the function of the government becomes facilitative rather than doing the negotiations. There, I think we see more and more. In spite of all the problems we have the best trading relationship with the US. We have a surplus. On the China question, we actually have a huge deficit. And the China economic relationship has a problem. We have a problem with the China economic relations. Some Americans might have a problem with us, but it's a growing relationship. In China, we're trying to decouple.
A big round of applause for Seema Sirohi and C Raja Mohan for such informative session. Thank you for being here.